They called it a Ronson because it lit on the first strike. To the men who rode into battle in Sherman tanks during World War II, that nickname wasn't a joke. It was a death sentence. While the M4 Sherman was fast, reliable, and cheap to produce, it was also a coffin on treads. Its thin armor and high profile made it an easy target. Its gun couldn't match the power of German Tigers or Panthers. And when it was hit, God help the crew inside. The smell of burning flesh, the screams of brothers trapped in molten steel. These were not rare tragedies. They were routine. And yet, thousands of young Americans rolled into hell inside those machines, knowing they had a worse chance of survival than the infantry walking beside them. This is not just the story of a flawed war machine. This is the story of the men who were told it would protect them, and then burned alive in it. Today, we're opening the hatch to a dark truth. Why Sherman tank crews were basically sentenced to death. The M4 Sherman was sold as a miracle of modern warfare. It was cheap, fast, and easy to mass produce. Designed in the early 1940s, it represented America's answer to armored combat. The military brass promised it would dominate the battlefield, but that promise would turn to ash for the thousands of young men sealed inside it. From the outside, the Sherman looked like a beast, measuring nearly 20 feet long, with a 75mm main gun and up to 5 crew members operating in tight synchronization. It could hit 30 miles per hour and was famously reliable. But here's the chilling truth. That reliability came at a deadly cost. In the rush to pump out tanks by the thousands, U.S. engineers prioritized quantity over survivability. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were designed to kill. Shermans were designed to roll off the factory line. Former Sherman crewman Belton Y. Cooper described it plainly. We lost 648 tanks in combat, but the Germans only lost about 100 in the same time period. You tell me who had the better tank. The Sherman's armor was a joke to the 88mm cannons mounted on German machines. American doctrine emphasized mobility and flanking. But what happens when there's no room to flank and the enemy sees you first? The turret ring was weak. The armor was only 50mm thick in many areas. Ammunition was stored along the sides of the hull, unprotected. And the gasoline engine, unlike the diesel engines of Soviet tanks, turned every Sherman into a rolling fireball when struck. The crews knew this. They felt it. Every time the engine roared to life, they knew they might be climbing into their own crematorium. Still, the U.S. Army insisted the Sherman was good enough that it would win through numbers. That it didn't need to be the best, just better than nothing. But try telling that to a 19-year-old gunner watching his best friend get vaporized in the turret next to him. When the Allied forces landed at Normandy on D-Day, the Sherman was front and center. Over 1,500 rolled ashore in the first waves. They were meant to spearhead the breakout, but as soon as the first Shermans creaked off the Higgins boats and onto the beaches, the myth unraveled. German bunkers, anti-tank guns, minefields. The terrain of Normandy was a nightmare for armor. And in the hedgerows of the French countryside, Sherman tanks were sitting ducks. Thick vegetation and narrow roads gave German Panthers the upper hand, letting them ambush U.S. tanks with devastating precision. Crews had to improvise, welding metal rhino tusks onto the front of their tanks to plow through the hedgerows. But it wasn't enough. German 88mm shells tore through Sherman armor like it was paper. One hit was all it took. Flames erupted instantly. Men screamed. Some died instantly. Others weren't so lucky. In a 1944 letter home, one crewman wrote, "We found a Sherman yesterday, the hatch blown open. Inside were just bones, charred black. I don't know their names, but I know what their last minutes were like. And that's enough. Even when Shermans outnumbered the enemy 5-1, the kill ratio was often reversed. It took 5 or 6 Shermans to take down a single Tiger tank, and often 3 of those would be burning before the German beast was even scratched. The Germans called it Tommy Cookers, a cruel nickname implying the tank roasted its British and American crews like meat. And yet, the orders kept coming. Keep advancing. Keep pushing. Commanders told crews not to worry. Air support would even the odds. But in the thick hedgerows, air power was useless. It was steel versus steel. And the Sherman lost. Repeatedly. To understand why Sherman crews were basically sentenced to death, you have to understand the inside of the tank. Cramped, hot, deafening. The space was so tight that a tall man could barely move. The gunner's seat was like a metal coffin. And once the hatches were sealed, there was no easy way out. The interior was lined with ammunition, shells stored along the sides, underfoot, and behind seats. There was no blast shielding. One hit from a Panzer or Tiger, and the Sherman exploded from the inside. Ammunition cooked off in a chain reaction, engulfing everything in a matter of seconds. Veteran tank gunner Frank J. Levesque recalled, "When we got hit, it sounded like God had slammed a sledgehammer against a steel drum. Fire burst everywhere. I remember the driver screaming, just screaming. Then, nothing. Escape was nearly impossible. Hatches jammed from impact. Flames consumed oxygen. And if the explosion didn't kill you, the smoke did. Crews were taught to button up, stay sealed in to avoid small arms fire. But when your tank is on fire, those same hatches become your death trap. It wasn't just combat that endangered them. Mechanical failure, friendly fire, mines, all constant threats. Crews lived in constant fear. Their nerves frayed. They were trained to trust the machine, but deep down, they knew it would betray them the moment it was tested. Some crews went as far as to line the inside of their tanks with sandbags, desperately trying to add some kind of improvised protection. Others stored their ammo in different spots, hoping to delay a fatal fire just long enough to escape. The truth is, Sherman crews weren't just fighting the Germans. They were fighting their own equipment. And that's a battle no soldier should ever have to fight. The German Tiger I tank was a nightmare made real. Weighing over 60 tons, its 88mm cannon could pierce a Sherman from over 2,000 meters, well beyond the Sherman's effective firing range. Where the Sherman's shot might bounce harmlessly off the Tiger's thick front plate, the Tiger could obliterate its target in a single, thunderous strike. This wasn't theoretical. This was mathematics. Cold, calculated odds of survival. Or, more accurately, of destruction. The Tiger was engineered for dominance. Its firepower, armor, and optics far surpassed the Sherman's capabilities. And the Germans knew it. In one of the war's most damning assessments, German tank ace Michael Wittmann single-handedly destroyed an entire column of Shermans and other vehicles at Villers-Bocage in June 1944. The British Shermans never had a chance. They were lined up like tin ducks at a carnival. One by one, they were lit up. Flames, explosions, bodies thrown from hatches. All by one Tiger. In response, American doctrine pivoted. Instead of fighting the Tiger directly, they swarmed it. 5 or 6 Shermans might charge one Tiger, hoping to distract it long enough for a side shot. That was the strategy. Not better armor. Not a better gun. Just more men willing to die. And it wasn't just the Tiger. The Panther, lighter, faster, but almost as deadly, was more common. It carried a high-velocity 75mm gun that easily shredded Sherman armor. The Panther's sloped armor deflected incoming fire, while the Sherman's boxy shape invited penetrations. In a grim twist of irony, some of the most effective tank killing in Europe wasn't even done by tanks. It was German anti-tank guns like the Pak-40, which could punch through Shermans like butter. One U.S. commander said, "Our tanks are like glass, beautiful to look at, but once hit, they shatter." To many Sherman crews, encountering a Tiger or Panther didn't mean a tough fight. It meant you were going to die. The lucky ones might get out in time. The unlucky ones would vanish in fire and steel. It's hard to describe what it was like to be inside a Sherman when it got hit, because most who lived through it don't talk about it, and many who didn't never had the chance. When a Sherman was struck by a high-velocity shell, the result wasn't always an instant kill. Sometimes it meant a slow burn. Flames creeping across the floor, melting uniforms, cooking flesh. Smoke filled every inch of space in seconds. There was no fresh air, no light, just noise, chaos, and pain. Former driver Joseph Barrel once described how a nearby Sherman was hit. "I saw the turret lid pop open like a jack-in-the-box and flames shot out. A man tried to crawl out, but he was already on fire. He never made it." Inside the tank, the heat could reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Ammunition exploded in secondary detonations. Shrapnel ricocheted inside like a blender. If you weren't killed by the initial blast, the fire took you. If not the fire, then the smoke. And if you managed to open a hatch, if it wasn't jammed or blown off, you had to escape through a tiny opening, all while the tank burned beneath you and bullets screamed overhead. Crews knew this. They heard the stories. They saw the aftermath. And they still climbed inside, day after day. Some wrote goodbye letters and kept them folded in their breast pockets. Others made pacts with crewmates. "If one of us burns, shoot us before we scream." The military tried to adapt. Later models of the Sherman included wet stowage for ammunition, surrounding shells with water jackets to reduce the chance of a fire. It helped, but only a little. By the time those modifications were widespread, thousands had already died. These weren't just tankers. They were boys, farm kids, mechanics, draftees. They didn't sign up to be martyrs. But inside a Sherman, that's what they became. The tragedy of the Sherman isn't just mechanical, it's moral. Because the people at the top knew. They knew how vulnerable these tanks were. They had the statistics. They read the after-action reports. And still, the orders came. American tank doctrine at the time was built on flawed assumptions. One was that tanks shouldn't fight other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers. So the Sherman was built to support infantry, not to take on Panthers or Tigers. But war doesn't follow doctrines. And in France, Belgium, and Germany, Shermans did face enemy armor, constantly. And they died in droves. The High Command, rather than redesign the tank or halt its deployment, doubled down. Why? Because the Sherman was cheap, easy to build. Henry Ford's assembly lines could churn them out faster than German factories could build a single Tiger. It was a war of attrition, and Sherman crews were the fuel. Even General George Patton, a famed tank commander himself, once wrote in his diary, "The Sherman is inferior. We must make better." But better never came. Not in time. Crews were told to rely on numbers, flanking, and air support. But what they needed was protection, and they didn't get it. It wasn't until late in the war that American forces deployed the M26 Pershing, finally a tank that could match German armor. But by then, the worst was over, and the blood price had already been paid. A quiet resentment grew among some crews. They didn't hate their officers, but they questioned why they were always sent forward first, into the meat grinder. Why their tanks lit up like torches while the enemies didn't. Why their friends never came back. But the brass kept smiling. These were boys fighting for freedom, told they were heroes, while being marched into hell inside a machine they knew wouldn't save them. For those who survived riding in the Sherman, the war didn't end when the gunfire stopped. Because the real wounds weren't always visible. Survivors carried trauma that no medal or parade could ever fix. Men came home with skin grafts over their faces, missing limbs, and lungs permanently scarred by smoke inhalation. But worse than the injuries were the memories. One crewman, Melvin Biddle, recalled, "You don't forget the smell. It's not like burning wood or fuel. It's human. And it gets inside you. You smell it in your sleep. You carry it forever." The horror of watching friends burn alive, of hearing screams echoing in a steel box, of scrambling for a jammed hatch while the floor beneath you melts. All of that got buried deep inside, and nobody back home wanted to hear about it. In post-war America, Sherman tankers were often overlooked. There were no blockbuster movies about their sacrifice, no statues in town squares. Infantry got recognition. Fighter pilots became legends. But the tankers? They were the ones who died before they could become heroes. Many drank. Many took jobs where they never had to hear loud noises again. Some never talked about the war at all, because to speak it out loud was to relive it. And for men like these, men who had been sealed in burning coffins, reliving it was too much to bear. Wives described them as distant. Sons remembered them as silent. It wasn't until decades later that PTSD was even understood. By then, most of the men who had climbed into Shermans during World War II had already buried the truth, along with too many of their friends. The Sherman didn't just kill men, it left survivors haunted by the way they lived. For every tanker who made it home, there was a memory burned into their mind that would never leave. They had walked away from death, but they carried it with them. The U.S. military's greatest defense of the Sherman was its numbers. American factories produced over 49,000 M4 Shermans during the war. That's more than double what Germany produced in all tank models combined. The logic was simple. We don't need the best, we just need more. And on paper, it worked. The Allies won. The Nazis were defeated. But at what cost? This strategy came with a brutal consequence. Human life became expendable. The math was clear. If it takes 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, and 3 get destroyed in the process, the U.S. could absorb that loss. But that meant sending 3 crews to certain death just to earn a slim tactical gain. These weren't numbers. They were lives, faces, families. Some veterans saw through the lie. In his memoir, tanker Richard Riley wrote, "They told us we were winning. But I kept wondering, if we're winning, why are we always the ones dying first?" The belief that American industrial might would carry the day led to a moral blind spot. We built Shermans not to save lives, but to end the war faster. And in doing so, we sentenced thousands of young Americans to die inside a machine their own commanders knew was inferior. The war planners knew the armor was weak. They knew the gun was outdated. They knew the gasoline engine turned it into a fire hazard. But they built it anyway. And not once, tens of thousands of times. What's worse, the Sherman became a symbol of victory in the eyes of history. It appeared in newsreels, sitting triumphantly on German soil. It was hailed as a hero. But for the men who lived inside it, it was never a hero. It was a coffin with treads. We remember the Normandy landings, the liberation of France, the triumph in Berlin, but we rarely remember what it took to get there, and the broken bodies left inside melted hulls along the way. In the end, the story of the Sherman tank isn't just about flawed steel or failed tactics. It's about trust betrayed, about young men who were told their equipment would protect them, only to die screaming inside it. It's a story that echoes through time, because it reminds us what happens when victory becomes more important than human life, when production lines replace protection, when we let our soldiers become statistics instead of sons, brothers, and fathers. Today, there are very few Sherman crewmen left alive. The ones who remain rarely speak of what they saw, but their silence is deafening. Their trauma, a monument more powerful than any marble statue. And now it's our job to remember them, not as faceless warriors in old war footage, but as young men who climbed into a machine they didn't trust, followed orders they didn't question, and paid with everything they had. If you've ever seen a Sherman tank at a museum, look closer next time. Don't just admire the tracks or the gun. Look at the hatch, the one so many tried to open in their final moments, the one that jammed shut just before the fire came. That hatch is more than metal. It's a symbol of everything war takes, of everything we owe. And to the men who climbed inside anyway, we remember you.